Hi, good afternoon. All right. So we are getting into the material for pertinent to test two. I hope you guys did okay on test one. If not, remember it's one of 20 something assignments that are worth 50 points. Okay, so don't sweat it if you didn't. Hope you noticed that you had two chances. All right. And so getting these names down. Any comments or questions? All right, well, feel free to unmute yourself and let me know should you have one, okay? All right, on this one, right? To be honest, I'm a little bored with this one. Not the topic, uh, but the argument. So often, right? You have a revision, you have a change, you have a new revisionist take on a given subject and an interesting thesis, etc. And this one has stood the test of time for a long time. And because evidently there's plenty of data to support it. But yeah, this might be the only topic from the early U.S. history class up through the more modern version uh, that I received the thesis as a student that I'm conveying to you. So I'm not proud of that, but like I said, everything I can get my hands on, I just have yet to find a new cutting edge thesis on this topic. All right. So at any rate, the argument goes, right, is that while we were fighting in the war for independence, we were at our most enlightened and most classically liberal that we arguably have perhaps ever been as a country. We're fighting against Parliament, namely, and Parliament's claim through the Declaratory Act that they can legislate for us, that we are virtually represented in their elected body. And of course, we didn't buy that, right? And of course, the propaganda took on big anti-monarchy overtones. So George III, of course, was vilified in our writings, in our pamphlets and posters and rhetoric and so forth. So while this is going on, right, the argument goes is that we really, our states really were at their utmost point of trying to safeguard themselves with enlightened institutions that would not become tyrannical over them. Okay. So you had, right, in these cases, you had a democratization of the electorate, like those who were considered the franchise, those who were considered citizens. Okay. But of course, they did not go um, in the direction of like Latin America. Latin America, they really went to the left in change. They were for citizenship for men of all colors, including the freed slaves. They abolished slavery in some of the places, or at least declared such, as they fought against the Spanish forces. And yeah, they had more time. They were like from 1810 to the 1820s, so they'd already seen our quote revolution and had seen the more radical French one. So at any rate, we relatively in many of the states they kind of democratized the franchise. They a lot of them issued some equivalent of a Bill of Rights. Okay, Pennsylvania. I'm not sure if it was the only state, but they went without a governor. They did not want any chief executive over them, and so that was very much in line with the rhetoric at the time, right? They didn't trust one, hence monarch over them in an executive position. Um, I think at least one state also became a unicameral legislator, only one branch. They didn't like the idea of an upper branch that was not directly elected by the people. And so they went in the direction of just having only uh, the equivalent of an assembly or the equivalent of a House of Representatives later on. Okay, so you had that as well. There were a few states in the North that issued gradual compensated emancipation of slaves. They opened They started public libraries in many of the states. Remember Diderot and Condorcet, and my subjective connection to the pursuit of happiness, the right of every person to cultivate himself to the utmost. And so you definitely had evidence, right? Then they elected members into this confederation, right? And the confederation was deliberately weak, and it was deliberately inefficient, and it was deliberately uh, uh, loosely organized. Okay, and that went in line with libertarian thought of distrust of government, right? So they had no one as the equivalent of a president in this new confederation. Okay, if your reps said no to a tax, it wasn't collected in your region, in your area. Um, they required more than a simple majority to pass a law, and of course to pass any kind of an amendment. Um, and remember, though, right? Nazi Germany was efficient in putting out legislation. So sometimes, uh, deliberately becoming inefficient can be a way of forestalling any kind of tyrannical person or faction from taking over. Okay, they liked it this way, supposedly. And so they just united over the big stuff, as confederacies do, in case there's an invasion or something, or a major rebellion, something of that sort. The states were somewhat autonomous, okay, like a league that they loosely chose to join. So at any rate, the conservatives, right? When you look at conservatives like John Adams, yes, he did not like the idea of how democratic each of the states had become. He thought that the majority of citizens were not prepared, were not equipped to make wise decisions in government. Okay, then you have people like Alexander Hamilton, a conservative, who thought almost solely of economics, and he saw the economic mess that was going on at this time, and so he wanted to be more centrally uh, organized for economics, if anything, economics alone. So these conservatives, right, who didn't like what they saw, what they could do, right, is because the founding fathers had a classical education, is they could point to people like Aristotle and different Greek philosophers who were not very big on democracy. Remember, demos just means the people in Greek. And, they had studied like Athens under Pericles, and they practiced a direct democracy. But the kicker was that, right, only about 1/10 of the people of Athens were declared citizens. But nevertheless, with that 1/10, they practiced direct democracy. And historically, when you read the story, it didn't last. It didn't end well. Okay. And that's exactly what Aristotle and other philosophers said would happen. Is what they contended, right? Was that the average person is led by his appetite. Like what we might say today is like the id, right? With Freud, the ID. I recall going on vacation, and my little boy was a toddler, and as we walked to our table at a restaurant, he grabbed something off someone's plate and helped himself to it. And it was, needless to say, it was mortifying. But he was just following his id, right? And he didn't yet have much of a super ego to tell him that he should not have done that. So at any rate, to Aristotle and the critics, they contended that the average person was led by his appetite. He would just go for what he desired, what he wanted, irrespective of the consequences of how it might adversely hurt others and how it might adversely hurt the entire, government, republic, or whatever it was. And so it was the opposite of civic virtue, and they thought that the average person would act as such. And then in addition to that, right, they didn't have the proper education to know, even if they did have good intentions, they weren't trained in political science. And so they wouldn't even hardly know what the wise decisions might be in governing, etc. And so hence what they would do is they would create a chaotic situation and then a demagogue, someone who manipulates the people, who claims to be one of them, who knows the emotional buttons to push and psychological buttons to push in the people to get them to follow him. And but of course, he has his own power in mind. And so hence it'll end with go from anarchy to tyranny. Okay, thought Aristotle and other critics in ancient Greece of democracy. Founding fathers had read that. So right, so the conservative founding fathers, they tried to continually remind the libertarian liberals like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson that that which the Greeks said and how it was going to come to pass here in this confederacy because it was too, quote, democratic for its time. And then, of course, they could look to the Scandinavian as well as to the Italian loosely connected confederacies and see how oftentimes they were jealous of one another. They fought with one another. There was no economic coordination. And they too didn't seem to last very well. And so they had read their history and they were trying to claim those things to the liberals. So the idea, number one, is, and it's a long held thesis, is that the people behaved and the government, the state governments behaved in such a way that fed into those negative stereotypes of a democracy and of a confederation. All right. So that when everything became a bit out of control, the conservatives could point to the liberals and tell them, I told you so. I told you this would happen. And now, trust us, we're going to establish a more centrally powerful republic like Rome. And of course, that's what we did. So at any rate, you get into examples of such, right, of these states. So the Confederate part, Virginia and Pennsylvania both claimed Western frontier, and they fought badly over that frontier. You also had New York and New Jersey had commercial wars with each other. Started with New York merchants coming into Jersey to sell their merchandise, and the New Jersey merchants lobbied their elected reps to put a stiff tax on the New Yorkers to give them an edge. And so then they did the same thing in New York, and it just escalated one step after another between those two states. And then when you have the Shays Rebellion, no one really came to the aid of Massachusetts when they had a very serious rebellion on their hands. Now, with that rebellion, what happened oftentimes is people elected into office were pressured to provide credit, right? To provide credit to their voters, because they wanted to chase after what would later be called the American Dream. Okay, so they went through great means to get. Sometimes they printed money, their own money. They tried to get in private bankers. They tried to get in international brokers, etc., to provide credit to their voters. Then, however, right, most of the voters, because America was very agrarian as far as the percentage of the population, a lot of them wanted to become cash crop farmers, right, to harvest some type of crop and to sell it for profit. That was the business, right, that they wanted to engage in as entrepreneurs. But you had a series of bad luck. You had weather issues, you had market issues, etc. So that they, with the money that they borrowed, they planned to make enough off their crop to pay that back, and then also, pocket the rest as profit. But it didn't work out that way. So then what they did is they put pressure upon their elected reps to grant stay laws, right? STAY. And a stay law, right, gave you extra time to pay back your loans. And in a few of the states that worked, and they kind of got out of it. But in places like Massachusetts, they never caught up. And they tried to issue a stay law for like the fourth consecutive time. And the elected legislator said, no more, no more. You have to a certain date to pay back your debts, or else they come and they collect on your collateral, right? And of course, what was their collateral? Their farms. So they sent judges into Western Massachusetts to put them on trial, to demand their debt, and if they didn't, they would declare a government takeover of their land, of their collateral. So Daniel Shays and others, they put on their old Revolutionary War uniforms, and as if it was somehow in the spirit of Minutemen, and they broke into the courts, and they threatened to kill the judges if they touched their land. And conservatives like George Washington were furious over this because they thought it was highly, highly irresponsible, immature. Pay back your loans. And so, at any rate, they had to raise the militia, and many of them scattered by that time. But they still had some battles. So they actually resorted to violence, and it shook the Confederation to its core. This rebellion, this Shays Rebellion, right? And so you have cases like that. You have factions. Remember, a faction is a group that shares the same self-interest, and an example would be the faction of the cod industry, the codfish industry of New England. They brokered deals with enough other reps of the Confederacy to shut down the Mississippi River to trade and to allow Spain to have a monopoly on that huge river. And it harmed a lot of markets and goods, etc. But they didn't care to what harm it was nationally, because now they would have no competitors with their cod fishing industry. And so those are just some of the examples that are given in here of the selfishness of people just kind of following their id rather than civic virtue and what's good for the whole community. So at any rate, the conservatives could say, I told you so, to the libertarians, and they went to meet in Maryland to make some changes to this government, and hardly anybody showed up. And I don't know if it's a safe inference, but the inference was made that they did not show up because people were so disgusted with the government that they didn't even know where to begin on making amends and changes and alterations to it. So from there, and from the no-shows to Maryland, they decided to meet in Philadelphia. The conservatives especially asked George Washington to put his blessing behind it in his presence. Excuse me. And so at any rate, he did. He showed up. And of course, they just scrapped the Confederation, and they wrote the Constitution in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. All right. So that is the thesis for number one. Okay. Any questions? All right. Well, the best attempt of the conservatives in trying to gain support for a less democratic, more centralized, more conservative republic were the Federalist Papers. Okay, the Federalist Papers were 85, 87, 80 something essays, and they're quite intellectual. Some of them go over my head, but they give arguments, philosophical, historical support for a need for this type of government. All right. And it's difficult to gauge how successful the Federalist Papers were, because the way that they worded things and literacy rates and so forth, it was mainly aimed for the liberal leaders, not the average layperson. And however, what some people say They interpret the absence of Thomas Jefferson as tacit approval, that he knew the Confederation was not working and something new had to be made, but he knew that it was going to go in a conservative direction, and he didn't really want to be a part of it. And so he, as many times, he went to France at this time, but he didn't stick around to oppose it. And a lot of conservatives made that point. So at any rate, they write the Constitution. All right. Now in the Constitution, as you'll see on the subsequent assignment, it's rather conservative. You think of, for instance, you have House Reps, then you have the Senate, then you have the president and vice president, then you have their cabinet, and then you have the Supreme Court. So the five major offices, the five major stations of the federal government, how many of those were elected by the citizens? The House Reps. That's it. And remember, with citizens, right? They did not declare universal male citizenship as they did in certain Latin American countries beneath us. But instead, they allowed each state to put up its own requirements for citizenship. So whoever your state allowed to be a citizen were able to elect the House Reps, and that's it, right? As you know, the president and vice president to this day are elected by the Electoral College system, so it's not a direct vote of majority, and the president is to handpick his cabinet and ambassadors, but yes, the Senate has to approve, and in the Senate at that time were elected by the assemblymen of the states, okay, by the legislators of the states. So that's one step removed from direct election. And as you know, that's no longer the case. In the 19-teens, under Woodrow Wilson, they made an amendment for the direct election of senators, but that'll be a while away. So then, right, in addition to that, you look at the preamble. In order to form a more perfect union, in order to protect the general welfare, in order to put down rebellion. It gives like 5 reasons why they were devising a new republic, right? And the first 4 of the 5 are conservative reasons. You can check out the preamble yourself. And finally, the 5th one says, and to secure the liberty of the citizens. So finally, the 5th one was an enlightened reason for devising this government. You have a property and contract clause that says basically those who owe money, who owed money before this new government still do. Those who have it owed to them still get it. Those who own slaves still own them. Okay, so they secured their own property. These founding fathers, right? So Article 1, Section 8, it has a long list of powers that Congress now has. They did not, whatever you would want to call the equivalent of Congress before under the Confederacy, they did not have most of those powers, quite a few of them. And so now, right, and the idea is that they're giving those powers to Congress at the expense of the states. And if you're libertarian, right, you want the states to be virtually autonomous because you had the assumption that government is more accountable to its people when it's more localized and it's closer to you. Okay, so Article 1, Section 8 was arguably pretty conservative. And like I said, the number of elected seats, very conservative. And the property and contract clause. You have a fugitive slave law clause that's in there. So if you're under contract of labor and you escape to another state, you have to be reprimanded, remanded, and brought back to your owner. So they put in a lot of conservative elements to this Constitution. All right. Yeah. So So, and remember, republic, right? We use that generically. What I just do is I keep it the definition simple to my brain, and as it was very simply put by Aristotle, is you have elements of a democracy where you have some power vested in a an elected body. You have some elements of aristocracy, and remember, in Greek, aristoi means the best. So you have some people who are not directly elected because they're supposed to be the most educated and men of leisure and have chance to read and study and know government, etc. And you also have elements of a monarchy. You have you have an executive with some powers, all right? And it's supposed to be a balance between those three. Like Rome, right? Rome had their elected tribunes, then they had their handpicked Senate, and then the Senate um, chose the two consuls, the two executives of Rome. So at any rate, that's what we have here. And so they write it during that summer, right? And remember, they had been elected in the past to represent their state in the Confederation. So because of such election from the past, they took it upon themselves that they were the rightful leaders to write this. Okay. So they write it and then they go back to their states and they try to have it ratified. Okay. And that's where they really start showing, in some cases, their true colors of conservatism. So, for instance, like in Pennsylvania, when they felt like they could muster a a uh, a majority, okay, of their legislator and actually ratify and approve this written constitution, they literally went to the taverns and libraries, etc., and forcefully grabbed these people and forced them so they could have a quorum. They could have 50% plus one of the legislators there. You also had many journalists who wanted to print this Constitution out to let the people see what it was all about. And you had many threats given to the journalists that they shall not do such, except for they will stop funding them with their patronage and so forth. Now, why would they do that? Well, for one, right, is they didn't trust the common person to have the wisdom to know what they were doing, as far as knowing, what was best for them. And then secondly, right, is they thought it would open Pandora's box, that there would be as many opinions as there are individuals, and that they would likely never get anything ratified if they put it up to some type of like popular referendum, right, where the people voted on it in mass. They just thought that they were in such a situation with the Confederation that they did not want, quote, anarchy, being stuck between two governments. They felt like this had to be passed so people would quickly transition from a unstable confederation to a more stable republic. However, right, that did not work. The liberal politicians and the people themselves rose up in many ways and made their voices heard. And that's what Pauline Maier is bragging about in her book. So, for instance, when they met to ratify it in Boston, Massachusetts, you had people from Braintree, all these small towns, come unannounced, uninvited, and say, "Hello, I'm coming from the town of such and such, and my people say that we will not approve of the Constitution unless it has something about the right to peacefully protest the government, right, or whatever, what have you." And so, right, I think you know where I'm going with this. They put together an amalgamation of um, all of the requests, all of the demands of these uninvited people to the ratification conventions, and put them together as the Bill of Rights. So yeah, the founding fathers, the conservatives that initially wrote it, they did not have a Bill of Rights. Now, they were not so conservative, right, whereby they openly protested the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, like as if they didn't want individual rights given to the citizens. But what they contended under a guy like Henry Wilson is they said that those rights go without saying, that they don't need to be written down. And once you write them down, then you're limited only to that which is written down as far as individual rights. But the people didn't buy that. And the people said, no, we would feel better if they were written down. We want a Bill of Rights. So then they included a clause where it said that they are not to acknowledge a nobility here. They put together a clause that guarantees the right to a republican form of government to every state. They put together the Bill of Rights, right, with the individual rights thereof. And notice it's technically the first 9 amendments, right, are individual rights. And the 10th gives to the states whatever is not given or implied to the federal government, to Congress mainly, okay, is reserved for the states in the 10th Amendment. So at any rate, we are to be grateful, we're to be happy that this generation did not just passively receive what was written for them by the conservative founding fathers, but made noise, right? Made threats, made demands that they include more enlightened, more classically liberal. Classical liberalism is all about the individual being autonomous and free. That they allow more classically liberal components to be added to this Constitution. So in a way, the conservative founding fathers are a bit vilified in her book. They almost begrudgingly allowed these things. All right. Does anybody have any questions on that?
I don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Lincoln. I appreciate that. All right. And so this the Constitution one will be due like a day after we meet next time. So I thought I would just kind of set it up a little bit for you so you don't have just one day, you know. But here, right, what I want you to do is to go through the Constitution, okay, and have a list of 3 examples of of clauses in the Constitution, okay, that are enlightened, 3 that are conservative, and 3 that are pragmatic, okay. And my subjective definition of these, right, is with enlightened, it's anything that tries to prevent tyranny. Okay, that's what the Enlightenment was all about, right? That which is natural leaves man free. Okay, so any part of accountability through checks and balances, through popular vote, okay, any kind of accountability of a certain branch, I think would constitute an enlightened facet to the Constitution. Okay, I think also like the president having to give his oath to follow the Constitution, that's enlightened, right? That's the rule of law. Having a Constitution that doesn't play favorites and has your enumerated rights on them, listed on it, right? Not to be erased. And a mere man or woman becoming president has to promise that he or she's going to abide by that written Constitution. Okay, I think that's an example of something enlightened in the Constitution. Now, conservative to me is 2 things. One, it conserves tradition, right? It's something that's not new whatsoever. So, for instance, bodies of governing authorities that are not directly elected by the people, I think is conservative, because that was the norm throughout the Middle Ages. Okay, slavery, allowing slavery, that continued, that conserved an old tradition. And also, I think conservative is when you have a strong centralized power over the local areas, over the local governments, namely the states. So you may want to take a look for conservative on Article 1, Section 8, like I mentioned. That gives the enumerated powers to Congress. Okay, those and also anything to do with like law and order, and to put down treason, to put down rebellion. Those are all just conservative aims of government. Okay. And then pragmatic just means practical. So what I think of, right, or like if there is a God forbid a death in Congress, they have a statute that says, okay, they're going to have another election, and or with the president, and they have someone step in the meantime before the next election, etc. To me, those are pragmatic components to the Constitution, just things that likely could or will come up, and they have a very practical method, or a very practical condition to meet. Okay, to meet that practical problem. So that's pragmatic. Okay, so look what I have here as examples. Article 1, Section 2. House reps are directly elected by citizens every 2 years and must be inhabitants of the congressional districts which they represent. So notice what I do. I ask you to please give me at least one sentence supporting why you think it is enlightened, why you think it is conservative, or why you think it is pragmatic. So here I go. This is enlightened because they're frequently held accountable to their constituents via election. They're privy to what their constituents face daily and have a residence in their constituents' environment, and are more accountable to their constituents by living in proximity to them. All right. So that's why I chose that one as enlightened. So if you could please give me 3 examples of that. All right. And by the way, I would just like, so basically you have 9 in total, right? 3 of each of the 3 categories. If you have at least 1 from Article 1, at least 1 from Article 2, and at least 1 from Article 3, that would make me happy. All right. Besides that, I don't care how lopsided it is if you do more in one article than others. Okay. But I would like at least 1 from the major 3. Because, right, the first article, because it symbolically is the most democratic, is Congress. The second article is the president and executive. And the third article is the judiciary, or the Supreme Court. All right. So look, I put the same one for conservative. In counting citizens to determine taxes and the number of House reps to serve in Congress from each state, the Constitution identifies slaves as 3/5 of other persons, and it excludes Native Americans as if they're from another country. This is conservative because just as in millennia past, the Founding Fathers did not embrace the courage and progressive tolerance to declare universal citizenship for all people. All right. And yeah, you'll see on here, you have a congressional district of 30,000 civilians. So that's just one voice for 30,000 people. And then pragmatic. I put Article 1, Section 8. That federal Congress can deal with practical issues like bankruptcies, inventions, borrowing money, and defending the nation against revolts and invasions. This seems pragmatic in that such issues will almost inevitably need to be dealt with sooner or later. Okay. I apologize for the little dogs. But see what I was saying? Look at this, the preamble. We the people, all right? A more perfect union, okay? That's conservative. Establish justice, that's conservative. Ensure domestic tranquility, that's conservative. Provide for the common defense, that's conservative. Promote the general welfare, that's conservative. And secure the blessings of liberty. Finally, the 6th one is something enlightened as far as a reason why we, the people, are giving our consent to this government. So, just kind of FYI, look at Section 2.2 here on Article 1. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25. This is my subjective take, okay? But I don't see anything too philosophical about that. Although, yes, you have Plato writing about like man is, I think, at the age of 30, I think in his Republic. It's been too long since I've read the Republic. But I think it was like at age 30, the educated philosophers come back and rule over their fellow Greeks. But at any rate here, right, having to be 25, I personally think that's pragmatic. I think that's just a very practical concern that people should have a certain amount of living experience, attain a certain level of maturity before they could serve in Congress. That's just me. Okay, because by all means, when you give your sentence to defend what category you put it in, I never fail to learn from you guys. Like, wow, that's a good point. I didn't think of it that way. Okay. When vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writs of election to fill the vacancies. I think that's pragmatic. Right. And here's the age of 30 for senators, 25 for House Rep. The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. And then when you go backwards, the House impeaches, right? And then the Senate tries the person that's impeached. And I think that's a classic example from Montesquieu of checks and balances. I think that's enlightened. Right. Congress shall assemble at least once a year. When you look at the early modern era, uh, parliaments would have to wait until the king or queen assembled them. And sometimes it'd be years and years. So just my 2 cents that they have to meet every year, I find that to be a bit enlightened. Okay, to ensure that those democratically elected get to do their thing and meet at least once every year. Each house determines the rules of its own proceedings and punishes its own members accordingly, etc. I think that Montesquieu would argue, right, that if you have checks and balances and you have different branches, they need to have not only accountability over one another, but they need to have a level of autonomy and insulation from the other, not to be manipulated by another. So I just personally think that number 2 and determining their own rules in the Senate, etc., is a bit enlightened. So it gives them. But then look at number 3. This one cracks me up. Each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings and from time to time publish the same. I mean, how enlightened is that, right? That's transparency. That's great. But look, accepting such parts as may in their judgment requires secrecy. Oh, are you kidding me? So at first, right, it seems as if we get to see what they're up to, the type of dialogue and conversations they're having in that chamber. But if they decide that it requires secrecy, we don't. All right. Let's see here. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House. You know, we fought the English, right? No taxation without representation, taxation by consent. So, of course, we ought to have that, right? That the democratically elected part of our republic, the House, they get to start the taxes. So that seems enlightened to me. I'm just going through kind of quickly here, things that just really jump out to me. And then here's Article 1, Section 8. Some of these you might think are pragmatic, very practical, like I had put as an example. And again, some might consider it very conservative of the central government having all these. But the one that really might seem conservative to you, right, or to others, again, I've had students included as pragmatic, is at the end of the list. Look at number 18. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, right? So that is like a rubber band that Congress can stretch. So if it's not on that list, right, if they could argue and convince the Supreme Court that that which they're doing, right, is necessary and proper in order to carry out one of these on the list, then they can do it. All right, the necessary and proper clause. Section 9, number 1 is the slave trade, saying they can't stop the slave trade until 1808. And they're going to go further than that. They're going to put a gag rule on it that you can't take the floor and even discuss it until 1808. And number 2 looks enlightened at first. Habeas corpus just literally means to have a body present. So if you're convicted of something, you need to be there present and be informed of what you're being indicted for. But you don't need to be there present if it's a case of rebellion or invasion. Let's see here. Just kind of FYI, the South is going to contend that a couple of the tariff laws, getting close to the Civil War, a little bit in the future, that they were in violation of number 6. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. Number 8 is enlightened. No title of nobility shall be granted in the U.S. And anyone holding office cannot accept a title of nobility from Britain or anywhere else of a foreign state. All right. And then these take away the rights of the states, some of which that they had during the Confederacy. Section 10. So the libertarians who wanted state sovereignty are not happy about Section 10. And the president, the fact that it's an electoral college and not popular vote, you could argue is conservative. You have to be a natural born citizen. You could argue that that is conservative. Let's see here. I would say again, number 8 is enlightened. Before he enter on the execution of his office, he or she shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. So again, the rule of law rather than the rule of man. So Congress can raise an army and declare war, but the president runs the army, the armed forces during war, right? You could say that's an example of checks and balances. You could say that because technically the president is a civilian office, putting a civilian over the military is a good check and balance. Or you could contend that, yeah, this is nothing new, that the king back in the days ran the armed forces when they went to war, and say that it's conservative. And number 3, I've had people do a few different takes on that one. The State of the Union address, right? Is this really just, a form of forced coordination between the executive and the legislator? Is it a means by which the president can try to manipulate or bully Congress into what needs to be passed? As you guys may know, in the later U.S. history, right? Teddy Roosevelt, he wasn't the only one to do it. Woodrow Wilson, right after him, did it as well, but or 2 presidents after him. They called it the bully pulpit, right? He would get up there and he would tell them progressive laws. It was during the progressive era, right? That needed to be enacted. And he told Congress, if you don't do it, I'm going to go over your head and go to the press. And I'm going to go to the people and complain to them that you're not doing your job. So there are many different directions you could take that, the State of the Union address. And then for life, right? I mean, obviously that seems conservative, right? But if you don't mind this quick indulgence of mine, okay, is technically, right, the House reps, and in a roundabout way, because they're elected by those that were elected in the state, and the Senate, and in a roundabout way through electoral college and only a 4-year term. Those three offices, right? They have to be at least a bit they have to feel at least a bit accountable to majority will, right? Or they won't get reelected. But who is going to protect the numerical minority, right? And you fast forward to like Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. We all agree that that finally was the right thing to do to end segregation for Black kids in school, right? But do you think if they would have been, if it would have been decided by congressmen who had to run for reelection, assemblymen in the states who had to run for reelection, or even a president who had to run for reelection, or especially a referendum like we do in November when everybody votes on it? Though none of those may have ever passed that. But the Supreme Court, right, because they sit for life, they could make the unpopular decisions. They could protect the numerical minority and not have to worry about popularity because they're in there for life. So just food for thought. And then here are all the cases in which they have primary jurisdiction. Okay. Because as you know, it says here at the bottom that they can make minor court systems, and they did, right? So you have the state level, and then you have the appellate system, the circuit courts, and then from there the federal courts, and then from there the Supreme Court. And so you could, put petitions all the way up to the Supreme Court. But with the petitions, they have jurisdiction to choose or not choose them, right? And from what I was taught, and I believe I understand, is the majority of them, they say no. They say no to more than they say yes to, right? But this list here, they have to address it. Okay? In law and equity or fairness or justice. Anything under the Constitution, anything under American laws, anything under our treaties, right? Anything with our ambassadors, and the list goes down here. Between two citizens of two different states, between one citizen of one state and the state that he traveled to, etc. So I don't know. I think personally you could. I personally think of pragmatic on that, because I can guarantee you when you look at each of these examples, there have been plenty of cases that were pertinent to those situations and then needed to be addressed, and the Supreme Court did. All right. Treason. Is that conservative? Is that pragmatic? How to deal with treason. Let's see here. This one right here, to be honest, I'm a little bit at a loss about, and I'm going to try to find someone better educated than I to ask. But Section 2, number 1, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Now, what they regularly state in the history books is at the end of the Civil War, primarily the Northern Republicans passed the 14th Amendment. And that finally, right, that finally nationalizes the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in all states. So I don't understand why that clause right there didn't do so already, but it just didn't seem to. So for instance, right, you had some free African Americans in 5 northern states that were allowed to be citizens. But if they moved to another state where that was not the case, their citizenship rights were not recognized, not until the 14th Amendment. So yeah, that's something I want to look into. Here. Number 2 is going to be important to Abraham Lincoln. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the U.S. So note, right, is whether it's by purchase or by conquest, when we've gained new territory, at first we put it merely under territorial status, and certain conditions have to be met before it is annexed as a formal state. So while it's still in that, you might say, legal limbo of a territorial area, it says Congress shall make the laws regulating it. So I think you know where I'm going with that by mentioning Abraham Lincoln. He is going to state, right, that Congress has the power when we take land from Mexico in the far west to say, hey, they're not states yet. They're not entitled to the rights of states. We can dictate right now in that territory, slavery is prohibited. Right. And then arguably number 4 is enlightened. The U.S. shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. And then it shows you the somewhat difficult process of passing an amendment. If they didn't have the laws of the U.S., number 2 would be enlightened, right? The Constitution is the sovereign power of this land, right? And theoretically, the people have given their consent in ratifying it. So technically, right, theoretically, it's the consent of the people that is the source of the sovereignty. And then they've given their consent to this Constitution that now rules over us. But notice it also says the laws of the U.S. So, of course, that's going to infringe upon when you have concurrent powers, things that are constitutionally legal for states to address, but they're also constitutionally legal for the Congress to address. Congress wins out over the states. All right, so then the First Amendment, you guys are familiar with that. Freedom of protest peacefully, freedom of religion, freedom of the free exercise of your thoughts, and your speech. And as you guys probably know, right, we put limitations on that. During World War I, they said if your expression creates an environment of clear and present danger, you can't express it. You can't, yell bomb on an airplane or fire in a theater. The right to bear arms. And yes, they were literal, the Scottish were, right? They wanted people so that theoretically, if the government turned on its own people, that's how distrustful they were of government. If the government turned on its own people, the people would be armed to protect themselves. Right? Although only the federal government has nuclear weapons. Right. Number 3 is a little bit passe, quartering soldiers. And then 4th, right, has been interpreted as your right to privacy. Unreasonable searches and seizures without a warrant. And then the 5th, right, I plead the 5th. You can't be forced to be your own to convict yourself, basically. You also have the double jeopardy clause in there. All right. The right to a speedy and public trial, an impartial jury. An impartial jury, that's interesting because, right, they think, okay, what exactly does that constitute? So at their generation, I think I could find evidence to suggest that it was socioeconomic. They wanted people from your same socioeconomic strata of what you did for a living to be able to determine your fate. But now, right, they've also taken on the ethnic component of that too. And other things such as like if they think like with Scott Peterson, they thought that he was universally considered so guilty here in this area that they needed to take the trial to elsewhere, where that sentiment was not so strong, and he had a fighting chance. Let's see here. To be informed of the nature of the accusation, to confront your hostile witnesses, of course, to have an attorney to do all this, to be able to subpoena witnesses in your favor, and the legal assistance of a counsel. Okay, and then this is not be I don't understand that one. I really don't. Because under very serious crimes, right? They could put your bail as high as they want. Does anybody know like how it coincides, how we are able to do that now with Article 7 here? Is it because I don't? I apologize, but I'm not familiar with how we're able to do that now, but we certainly do, right? Especially something that's pretty grave like murder. Yes, the excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines, nor cruel and unusual punishment. And that has changed, right, from time to time. First, they said the electricity was okay. Hmm. 9 is not ringing a bell. Sorry. And then number 10, of course, the libertarians are going to love. The power is not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. All right. Do you guys feel okay on these 2 assignments?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, good, Kyle. All right, Mas Hermanos. Jacob, thank you. All right. Well, thank you. It's good having you guys. I appreciate you.
Yep, you too.
All right. I better let you go. I don't understand. I have it plugged in, but something's not plugged in behind the computer, I guess. So you guys take care, okay?
All right. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob.